getting a vaccine. No one likes getting needles, but we know that the vaccine is going to help protect us against being infected with this virus, and hopefully it's going to help stop the spread of the virus. And I think Health Canada has really shown that they are reviewing the safety of these vaccines to the smallest detail, which I think is really important and has given me confidence that I want to get the vaccine.
Well, that's from CBC Kids, where reporter Isabel McNeil was interviewing virologist Alison Kelvin from Nova Scotia's Dalhousie University. And as you can imagine, kids have a lot of questions about vaccines, and so do their parents. And we know it won't be long until kids 5 to 11 will be able to get the shot in Canada. And so whether you're a kid or parent or neither, today is your chance to ask questions about COVID-19 and the vaccines. And once again, we're joined by Dr. Joseph Blondeau. He's the head of microbiology at Saskatoon's Royal University Hospital. He also teaches about infectious diseases at the University of Saskatchewan. Now, one thing to remember, Dr. Blondo is not part of policy decisions made by the government. But if you have other questions, give us a call right now, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email your questions to bluesky@cbc.ca. You can tweet me directly at TweeterMillsCBC, and I'll pass those questions on to Dr. Blondo. And if you're on social media right now where you're listening to the show, we're live streaming today's program on the CBC Saskatchewan and CBC Saskatoon Facebook pages, so you can ask your questions in the comments section as well, and we'll try to get those on for the doctor. But I can tell you the best way to get your questions on is to call, again, right now, 1-800-716-2221. Well, let's get the conversation going now, and as usual, we're very grateful Dr. Blondo is spending the noon hour with us. Great to be talking to you again, Doctor.
It's my pleasure, Peter. Thanks for asking me to come back yet one more time.
Always, yeah. Well, we know things have been pretty difficult for healthcare workers these days. Just how are you doing?
We're doing pretty good. We practice in laboratory medicine, and as the number of cases go up, then so does demand for the services in lab medicine. And we're all connected in this sort of great circle of healthcare. And it's been busy for us. And, we're like other services, we're a little bit short-staffed, and we've got people tired, and, we're like everybody else. We just want this to be over and life to return back to normal, but we're not quite there yet. So we're showing up every day, continuing to do what we do.
Well, before we focus more on kids and vaccines, because that'll be a big one today, of course, there's actually some news on vaccines in general. What new information do we have from the CDC when it comes to COVID-19 infection probabilities? The fact that vaccines are showing to protect more than just, having COVID-19.
Yeah, so, there's a report that came out a few days ago, and I got an alert on it this morning. There's a question that we get all the time, happens to be, what if I was naturally infected? Do I still need to get vaccinated? And the report that's out from the CDC, it's in a magazine called Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, actually looked at a lot of individuals in the United States, again, so a large database. And what they were actually able to show was that if you were unvaccinated or naturally infected, you were obviously much more likely to get infected if you're unvaccinated, or reinfected if you had natural infection, as compared to being immunized. So it's just with a 2-dose regimen. So it's just another important piece of information to show that just because you had an infection, we know that immunity can wane to this virus, and we look at other examples of seasonal coronavirus that cause the common cold. We know that immunity doesn't last very long. So this evidence would seem to suggest that immunity does not last as long with seasonal infection, perhaps, and your risk for, or with a natural infection, your risk for reinfection is greater than if you've received the 2-dose vaccine regimen. So I think it's another piece of important information to say, get out and get vaccinated and complete your vaccine regimen by getting the 2 doses. So I think, another piece of important data.
Yeah, Dr. Blondo, just kind of sticking with that, I remember, last year when we maybe knew a little bit less, there were lots of people, of course, sharing on social media being like, oh, I had COVID-19. Why do I need to wear a mask? I've got the antibodies now. I'm good to go. But, just as for me as a sports fan, I've known, multiple athletes who are unvaccinated who've had it multiple times. And that's been pretty well documented just in the sports world. What more can you say about that?
Well, we've repeatedly talked about the fact that as the epidemiological evidence continues to be amassed, we recognize that there's this phenomenon of breakthrough infections. So these are individuals who were immunized, fully immunized, and ended up contracting the virus. A large database out of the U.S. that we commented on previously looked at over 181 million people that were fully vaccinated, and they clearly showed that about 19,500 of those had breakthrough infections. And here's the good news. About 14,500 of those who were hospitalized didn't have a serious outcome, so they got better and went home. And only a relatively small number, 4,000, again, out of 181 million, so the database is enormous. There were deaths in a little over 4,000, of which 800 of those, about 4,400, of which 800 of those, the deaths were attributed to something other than COVID. Like they were in an automobile accident, for example, but happened to test positive for COVID. So they died from their injuries, not necessarily from the COVID. So out of that 181 million people that had breakthrough infections, only 3,300 or 3,600 died. Now, I don't want to say only as if that's not significant, but it does tell you the power of the protection of the vaccine in preventing people from getting serious disease. And the final point on that, Peter, is that over 80% of those individuals that ended up with a more severe infection were greater than 65 and had comorbidities. So again, the vaccine protects against severe disease, but it's not 100%. And, this most recent data is another piece in the puzzle saying the importance of having that immunity from vaccination.
Well, and Dr. Blondo, before we get to our calls, because we already have a few lined up, just something that you touched on there that I'd like to clarify because it's a question that we get quite regularly, right? I'm looking at yesterday's new COVID cases, right? And you see the pie chart breakdown, 71% not vaccinated, 6% partially, 23 fully, right? And we often get questions from people. It's like, is it better to be just partially vaccinated? But of course, that's not the case. This is because of, like you just mentioned, the amount of people who are fully vaccinated is much higher than partially. Can you just touch on that a bit?
Yeah, so in people who are partially vaccinated, where they haven't had their second dose, and perhaps, or they have, but they haven't had that 14 days for their antibodies to get up to a particular level, there's still some vulnerability there. And so when you look at numbers as you're describing there, it's clearly shows that this current fourth wave we're going through is a fourth wave of the unvaccinated, which are accounting for the vast majority of not only the cases but also the hospitalizations and ICU admissions. And that the possibility of having a breakthrough infection, albeit mild, because most of these are mild, is still possible. And so then it begs the question, and we've talked about this as well, as to whether or not, even with being fully vaccinated, you still should also practice some of these other important measures like distancing and wearing a mask. And I think that that's really important if you happen to have members of your family that could be potentially vulnerable to reinfection and perhaps a more serious disease. So we're not past this pandemic yet. And so I still think a combination of measures is still important as we move forward.
All right, listeners, again, our guest right now is Dr. Joseph Blondeau, head of microbiology at Saskatoon's Royal University Hospital. If you have a question about COVID-19 or vaccines, please get your calls in right now, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca or tweet us at blueskycbc. Again, that number to call, 1-800-716-2221. And we're also live streaming today's show on the CBC Saskatchewan and CBC Saskatoon Facebook pages, so you can ask your questions in the comments section. We'll try to get to them. I already see a couple that we'll get to shortly here. But first, let's go to a caller. John is in Saskatoon. Hi, John.
Hi, how are you?
Doing well. What's your thoughts?
I'm all mixed up here, and it wouldn't be the first time, but a while ago, it was indicated by Dr. Blondeau that certain viruses take precedence or have a stronger overbearing over other viruses, and that was as a result of last year of not having as many flu people with the common flu that as a result of that virus was taking over. Is there a reason why we should be getting the flu shot that would stop us, even though that the virus is going to be stronger and predominant over this?
Thank you for that question. So the short answer to the question is yes, absolutely, provided there's no contraindication for you taking the vaccine. Last year, we had a respiratory season that was predominated. As a matter of fact, it was exclusively with COVID-19. We did not see the types of seasonal viruses that we normally see every respiratory season, that being flu, rhinovirus, seasonal coronavirus, RSV, just to name a few of those. We didn't see any. And the reason why, I think, was because a lot of the country was in some type of a lockdown. We were all masked. There were a lot of restrictions that were in place. And so I think that those restrictions helped to curtail last year's respiratory season. But this year, we already know that some of these other viruses are circulating. So influenza virus now has already been detected in the United States on both the East and the West Coast. Here in Saskatoon, we've already identified rhinovirus. We've had now positive cases of a virus called RSV, or respiratory syncytial virus. So it looks like we're going to have more of our typical respiratory viruses back this season. And so it's only a matter of time before influenza will show up in Saskatchewan. And for that reason, the flu vaccine, in my opinion, is something that's important to have. And I've already had mine. So as soon as it became available, I went and I had mine right away, because flu will be back.
Dr. Blondeau, can I quickly ask you, because I'm usually one of these people that plans to get it and then forgets and forgets and forgets. Is it always a good time to get it, or do you need to get it early?
No, I mean, I think that once the flu vaccine becomes available, go out and get it. If we start identifying that we've actually now found flu in the city, and we will let you know when that happens, then you're going to see a rush. And everybody will be wanting the flu vaccine at that time. And so, to my way of thinking, you should be lining up to get it now before the virus shows up. That way you're protected in the event the virus is here, and then you don't have to stand in long lines when everybody else is looking to do so.
Great. John, thanks you so much for your question, for calling. We got a ton more questions already lined up, so we're going to have to let you go. But let's go to Facebook. Bunny asks a question. If you get vaccinated, how many days should you stay home after getting the shot?
If you're, that really depends on the individual. There's no reason to stay at home. Some people will have some mild symptoms. It could be a sore arm. You could be feeling a little bit tired, lethargic. There has even been sort of mild fevers described by some people. But because this is not a live virus vaccine, you're not at risk to anybody. It really depends on how you feel after the vaccine.
Great, thank you. Let's go back to the phone lines. Rob is in Saskatoon. Hi, Rob.
Hello. I'm enjoying your show here. Some time ago, a few years back, I got inoculated for the normal flu shot, and I started to have some reactions from that, and I asked the doctor about it, and he said, you may already have the antibodies in you that we're giving you the shot for, and you might have a little bit of a war going on, and I was wondering now, like with this COVID shot, I had heard some people say that you should get tested and see if your antibodies are good against this virus, and if they're not, then maybe think about getting the COVID-19 shot. And also, I'm hearing that after 90 days, if you do have the COVID shot, it starts dropping off, the protection drops off quite quickly. So are you hooked into that system forever once you do take those first few shots?
So I'll answer the last question first. Nobody knows the answer to that one, including myself. We don't know whether or not this will become a seasonal requirement for immunization. It'll really depend on when the pandemic is declared over, and then how much activity of COVID remains within the population. So that's the last question. In regards to the first question, having had a previous influenza vaccine, it's likely that you still probably have some pre-existing antibody that may be present in your body, but that in and by itself is not a contraindication for receiving the next annual flu vaccine. And the reason being is because sometimes the formulations in the vaccine change based on what viruses are going to be circulating in the coming respiratory year, and that is determined by a very complicated process. And it just could be that on that particular vaccine, for whatever reason, you may have had a little bit more of a symptomatic response to immunization. But if that's a concern, I would rediscuss that with your healthcare provider once again. In regards to how long do these antibodies last, that's a moving target. Those investigations continue to go on, but what we're saying at this point in time is that your antibody is protective for at least 6 months based on the current evidence. And then after that, probably a requirement for a booster shot if you're in an identified group. But you are right that antibodies do drop off over time. So the question becomes not whether or not you still have antibody, but whether or not you have enough to be protective in the event that you're exposed to the virus again. And then your last question was about an antibody test. There's no antibody test that's currently available that would tell you whether or not you have enough antibody on board to be protective. We do not offer a routine antibody test in this province for that reason, and it's only available under very, very strict criteria. And so providing an antibody test and giving somebody a false indication that maybe they have a lot of antibody and they shouldn't be revaccinated could actually be something that's dangerous. So no reliable antibody test at this time.
Still a lot of gray areas there then, I see. Well, thank you so much, Doctor. I appreciate it.
You are most welcome. Peter, to his last point,
yeah.
I mean, new data becomes available every day.
Right.
And so, opinions change, recommendations change as new data becomes available. And, we may be revisiting this in, who knows, a month or two or longer.
Right. I appreciate that. Let's get another Facebook question on. Brian writes, I have COVID blisters. Just how long till they're all gone? I haven't heard of that, Dr. Blondo. Do you know?
No, I don't. I can't answer that question.
Right,
I'm sorry.
No, I haven't heard of that either, and I'm not sure if they mean from the vaccine or from getting COVID or what. So let's just move along. Sorry, Brian. If you want to provide more context, and maybe we'll get to it later down the road. Let's go back to the phone line. Stick it in Saskatoon. Darren is on the line. Hello, Darren.
Hi there. I'm just curious about our numbers are dropping in Saskatchewan, which is great. Is it due to the measures where we've increased, we're not allowed to circulate as much? Is it due to people being forced to vaccinate? Will they continue to drop? Is the data showing that it's going to continue to drop? I'm just curious to know what our trajectory is.
Model numbers, so I can't share with you what I don't have. We had anticipated back a while ago that perhaps we would start to see our numbers go down, and thankfully they are going down, but that doesn't mean that this wave is currently over. We've seen in the past where we've seen some dips in the number of numbers and only for them to go back up. So I think we're just going to have to wait to see whether this trend continues. It's very encouraging at this point in time that the trend is downward, but one of the things that we need to be now concerned about is will we see an increase in the next couple of weeks as associated with the Halloween weekend and perhaps people gathering for social events or parties? And as the weather turns colder and people are gathering more indoors, are we also going to see an increase in the number of cases? And we simply don't know that at this point in time. But I, for one, am encouraged to see the numbers going down, and I really hope they continue to go that way. But I can't tell you more beyond that.
Great. Thanks, Darren. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Callers and Dr. Blondo, please stand by. I think this is a good chance to go back to CBC's Tori Gillis with a look at the news story she's following this hour, because Darren was just talking about are things getting better, but I know from listening to Tori's news today that we also know testing is down. So let's take a quick news break. Hello, Tori.
Hey there, Peter. Well, on top of the latest COVID-19 news, also coming up in your news, the Greg Furtuck murder trial is shifting gears as it enters its 9th week from the courtroom now to the judge's chambers. The Crown and defense have finished calling their evidence and witnesses, and now the lawyers are working on their written arguments for Justice Richard Daniluk. Now, Furtuck told undercover police posing as criminals that he killed his wife and dumped her body in a rural area near Kenniston, and all of this evidence came out during what's called a voir dire, a trial within a trial. So now the judge will be deciding on how much of that evidence and witness testimony he accepts in the trial itself. We'll have the very latest on that coming up in your news. As well, changes to the Saskatchewan Income Support Program and other factors are a few reasons why the Saskatoon Food Bank is preparing for a surge in demand. And its executive director has given us some tips on exactly what food banks need right now. What's the best way to help? That's coming up in your news as well. We'll have all of that coming up right here at 1 o'clock.
Thanks very much, Tori.
Thanks, Peter.
That's CBC's Tori Gillis with a news update this hour. And all right, folks, do you have any questions about COVID-19 or vaccines? You can give us a call right now, 1-800-716-2221. Our guest is Dr. Joseph Blondeau, head of microbiology at Saskatoon's Royal University Hospital. Again, that number to call, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. You can tweet me directly at TweeterMillsCBC to ask your questions, and I'll put them forward to Dr. Blondeau. I haven't got any questions on Twitter yet, but we are getting lots of questions on the CBC Saskatchewan Facebook live stream. You can go to CBC Sask or CBC Saskatoon Facebook pages and put your questions into the comments on that live stream. You can also follow along to the show there. Again, get your calls in right now, 1-800-716-2221. Dr. Blondo, I haven't asked you a general question, just about some of the questions you're getting these days about vaccines. What are you hearing from folks?
Well, you had touched on it at the beginning of the hour, and that was what's going to happen with children, and when can we expect the vaccine to be available for kids between those ages of 5 to 11. So people who are looking at the news will know that the FDA has essentially given its blessing to the COVID vaccine. And I think what's also important for the listeners to understand was that there was a completely separate scientific body that was asked to review the evidence as well. This would be a body not associated with the government approval process or the pharmaceutical company. And their responsibility was to look at the evidence and to come forward as to whether or not they endorse the findings of the study. And apparently this independent body came by with an overwhelming yes to the value of the vaccine in children. It has to pass one more step, and that is to be reviewed by the CDC and then wait for the recommendation for the CDC. And so in the United States, at least, there could be vaccine technically available for administration to children within the next couple of weeks if all of these approval processes line up. And so people are asking, did it work in kids? And the data from over 2,200 children that were enrolled in the study, they got a dose, approximately a third of the dose given to adults, divided by 21 days, so two doses as well, showed that it was about 91% effective at preventing symptomatic COVID infection. So this data would be consistent with the data that was seen in the adult population when COVID-19 vaccines were being investigated at that time. So I think this is very, very encouraging, and now we'll just wait for Health Canada in order to make its decision, and then to hopefully not be too far behind the Americans in regards to the vaccine rollout.
Doctor, is it just one vaccine they're looking at for kids right now, or are there multiple that might be available?
No, Pfizer is probably the farthest ahead, but Moderna apparently has already submitted some documentation as well. I've not seen anything on either of the AstraZeneca or the Johnson & Johnson. I can only assume studies are going on with them, but I don't know that as a fact. But certainly I think the Pfizer and the Moderna are the ones that are the furthest ahead.
Great, thank you. Let's go to an email from Robert. Robert says Saskatchewan Health Authority statistics report on the number of recovered cases. Do you know how they determine how someone has recovered, and does that include long-haul cases?
I can't answer the second question.
Right.
I don't know if the long haul cases are included in there. The long haul cases, just for people who are not familiar with the term, are individuals that have experience symptoms that last for a period of time after they've technically recovered from the infection. There have been other definitions out there as to what that means, but some say later, greater than 4 weeks. Others say greater than 12 weeks after recovery. Determining that somebody's past infection they've recovered is primarily based on time. And the reason why we know that is that if we do a PCR test on an individual who was positive, they could remain positive for up to 3 months after they first detect the positive, because you can detect remnants of RNA in the patient's specimens. So that's primarily done by time in terms of recoveries.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Blondeau, and thanks, Robert, for emailing in your question. Let's go back to the phone lines. Our first call in Regina today, Harley is on the line. Hi, Harley.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead with your question.
Okay. Well, it's a comment. I'm living proof that the vaccine works. And in a nutshell, a couple months ago, I was in a vehicle with a coworker for over 2 hours, closed windows, no masks, heat blowing, and again, in that person's office the next day visiting, same thing, no masks. This was on a Monday. On a Wednesday, this person called in sick. On Thursday, they called in sick. On Friday, they were in the hospital. On Sunday, they were on life support, and they were on a ventilator for almost 20 days. I have not suffered so much as a sneeze or a runny nose, and I'm living proof that the vaccine works. And I am living proof that it saved me from significant illness like my friend went through. And I'm a 3 vaccine person because of I'm young. I take a medication that compromises my immune system, and I am a firm believer that if it was not for the vaccine, I could have well been in the hospital and suffering long-term effects. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thanks for calling, Harley, and sharing your story, and best wishes. I hope that your coworker is doing better now. Dr. Blondo, just any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really nice of you to phone in and share that story, because it's a real world example of somebody who would have received a significant exposure and the benefits of vaccination. And even if this individual had have become infected, it's quite likely they might have only had a mild infection, meaning that the vaccine still did what it was supposed to do. Sadly for his friend, the fact that they had to go through, such a, very serious illness requiring, intensive care admission and ventilation, still serves to remind us all on every day how dangerous this virus is.
Yeah. All right, let's go to a question on Facebook. Anne writes something I think you've heard before, Dr. Blondeau, but something that's important to address because I know a lot of people have questions, particularly with vaccines now rolling out for kids. Anne wants to know, how can we possibly know the long-term effects of this vaccine on our children? mRNA technology is so new. What will happen to our kids in the future if they are vaccinated with an mRNA vaccine? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, the actual technology behind mRNA vaccines is not new. It's just that their use has really come into the forefront with the COVID pandemic. That the actual technology dates back 30 or so years when it was being investigated as a potential specific treatment for certain types of cancers. But you know what? The caller does raise, or the person asking the question does raise a point, and that is, now that this type of technology is being used, do we actually know the long-term consequences? I would say we don't, because it's a very, very new vaccine. But it would be no different than any other vaccine which gets developed even by more traditional methods, because there would be questions about its long-term effect on individuals who receive the vaccine as well. And I think that what we're probably going to see going forward is this type of technology will actually become more commonplace to use for vaccine production. I think that the speed at which these vaccines can be produced will actually appear to be very, very attractive going forward.
All right, folks, again, our guest right now is Dr. Joseph Blondeau, head of microbiology at Saskatoon's Royal University Hospital. And we've got a few callers on the line right now. Lorraine, Marilyn, James, stand by. I'll get to you very shortly. But you've got time to call now and get your questions in for the doctor. 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca or tweet me at TweeterMillsCBC. And if you want to listen, follow along, and get your comments in on Facebook, we are live streaming right now on the CBC Saskatchewan and CBC Saskatoon Facebook pages. Again, call 1-800-716-2221. Let's go to Lorraine in Saskatoon. Hi, Lorraine.
Hi, I'm calling with a question, but I'd first like to know that, like everyone to know that I think Dr. Blondeau is considered to be a rock in our journey here. So I certainly appreciate his comments. My question is about got thinking about categories of people who get COVID after their second vaccine, but within the 2 weeks after the vaccine, are they considered to be unvaccinated at that point?
Partially vaccinated.
But for instance, when you look at the dashboard that we have, there isn't a category for partially vaccinated.
Well, I think it's not fully immune, right? I think it is. That's how they call it.
Okay, but if I look at the dashboard, there's unvaccinated, and then there's the vaccinated after 2 weeks for full coverage. So I'm just wondering, where do these who are less than 2 weeks after are they still considered to be unvaccinated?
I think they're considered to be not fully immune. So they differentiate those from people who are fully vaccinated.
So would they?
And so I'd have to go back because I know that the federal dashboard, and I thought I saw the same thing on the provincial dashboard, differentiated between unvaccinated, partially vaccinated, which mean that you would have one dose, and then the group not fully protected, and then fully vaccinated. That's how I think the federal dashboard went.
I haven't looked at the federal one, but I'm looking at the Saskatchewan one. It's unvaccinated or first dose less than 3 weeks, vaccinated first dose greater than 3 weeks. But in terms of, we hear about unvaccinated and vaccinated. So I was thinking, so where do those people fit in? Are they considered to be unvaccinated even though they've had the vaccine, but it's less than 2 weeks?
To my way of thinking, and based on my understanding, I would consider those to be either partially vaccinated or not fully immune. So I would see those as two categories in between the fully vaccinated and the unvaccinated. That's how I would see those. And when you look at that data from the feds, the last time I looked at it, it was about 81% of all of the new cases were unvaccinated. And then if you go over to the fully vaccinated, it was just a couple of percentage points, and then the remainder were filled in by those that had either one dose of the vaccine or the others who had both doses but weren't considered to be fully immune. Yeah. So that's how I saw that fitting together.
Yeah, and I see the breakdown, Dr. Blondeau, on the government's daily updates, right? And it does, kind of clarify that a little bit better. So, Lorraine, I know it's tricky to find these numbers and kind of break it down day to day, but I think if you go to the Saskatchewan Health Authority's daily release, it kind of breaks it down a little bit better for you, where it clarifies, right? Vaccinated does count second dose greater than 14 days, and then unvaccinated or first dose less than 21 days. So again, it's a little tricky to find these numbers and to break them down in those ways sometimes, particularly when we have to kind of decipher the information we get from the government some days. So hopefully that helps you, Lorraine. Yeah. Let's go back to the phone lines. Marilyn's in Regina. Hi, Marilyn.
Hi, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well. What are your questions?
My question, I have two, actually. Unfortunately, my son did not get vaccinated and has now contracted COVID. He was diagnosed on Saturday. And what I wanted to know, firstly, is he's only suffering minor symptoms, a high fever, but that's about it. Whenabouts does the symptom of respiratory problems occur?
It's
after you've
variable.
been diagnosed?
Yeah, it's variable. So your son, I'm assuming, is a younger individual. So
31.
the data would so the data would suggest that he has a lower likelihood of progressing to having more severe symptoms, but he's not 0%. That's for sure. I can tell you that some people are going along and they're doing quite well, and then all of a sudden they just crash and require elevated levels of care. So what I would say to you, and you certainly can contact your own physician to make sure that you have the right guidance on your family, is that if your son is unfortunate enough to get to a point where he feels like he's having some difficulty in breathing, then you take him to an assessment right away. Don't wait. So again, any indication that perhaps he's having trouble breathing, take him for assessment right away. Okay.
My second and final question is, when he recovers, how long afterwards can he get a vaccination or start his vaccination journey?
So that's changed a little bit, but I think it's 3 weeks. I'm going to have to check that, and I'll send it. It was a little bit longer, but I think they've revised that recommendation. But I'll try and look it up, Lorraine, while I'm still on the phone here, or still on the show, and see if I can give you an answer here in a couple of seconds.
Okay, thanks for sharing your knowledge with us all.
It's my pleasure.
And thank you for calling, Marilyn. Best of luck to your son. Hopefully everything goes well. Yeah, well, I want to send it back while Dr. Blondo looks that up. I'll put it back over to you, listeners. James, stand by. We'll get to you shortly. Lilian as well will be with you in just a minute. If you want to get your calls in, we got about 12 minutes left here in the show. Our guest is Dr. Joseph Blondo, head of microbiology at Saskatoon's Royal University Hospital. Get those calls in for questions about COVID-19 or vaccines right now. 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. You can tweet me directly at TweeterMillsCBC, and I'll pass your questions along for Dr. Blondo. And if you are joining us on Facebook, thank you very much for joining the live stream. We're on the CBC Saskatchewan and CBC Saskatoon Facebook pages, so you can get your questions in there. Dr. Blondo, I have another question from Facebook from Bahar, who has something kind of similar to just piggyback off Marilyn's questions of, are there any treatments or potential treatments that are being researched that are effective in treating severe COVID for those suffering in ICU?
So, yes, I mean, there's an antiviral called remdesivir that may be used, and there have been some studies looking at monoclonal antibodies. So monoclonal antibody is an antibody that's developed specifically to target the spike protein for COVID-19. But studies have shown that in those particular instances, those antibodies are best when they're given earlier, when somebody who's at risk is determined to be infected, and they give them the monoclonal antibody before they have a chance to progress to a more severe disease. There have been other things that have been tried, including using, serum or plasma from an individual that was previously infected and has antibody that could be infused into an individual in an attempt to try and slow down the infection, etc. But once a patient gets into critical care, it's more about trying to manage them through their critical care episode. That does involve, some strategies for treating COVID, but it may also involve the use of broad spectrum antibiotics to either prevent them from getting infected with a bacterium, or maybe they've got infected with it, and now the antibiotic is designed to make sure that they don't have their bacterial infection complicating their COVID infection. So it's a difficult group of patients, and sadly, the amount of treatments that are available for COVID in that group of patients still remains quite limited.
Great. Oh, go ahead.
Questions about 10 days. As soon as you've recovered and are out of isolation, you can go for your vaccine.
Sorry, I was interrupting you there, Dr. Blondo. You want to say that again?
So I just had a text from a colleague of mine who knows the answer to this question, who said that as soon as you're out of isolation and you're feeling better, you can get your vaccine. So about 10 days.
Excellent.
So about 10 days after you've been identified as being infected. So I would say in that sort of 10 days, 2-week window, a person can go get immunized.
Not only do we have you, Dr. Blondo, we have your friends listening and texting in information. I absolutely love it. You guys are so invaluable. We can't thank you enough for being here. And I also want to thank James in Saskatoon, because James has been very patient. Go ahead, James.
So I'm actually going to pivot over so slightly. Initially, I was going to have a discussion about the how we can feel about the third shot, because it was interesting that after 2 shots, we deemed that to be fully vaccinated. Now we're asking the public for a booster, and I guess the question was, is there any potential that the booster could cause a complication? The reason that I would have that premise was because any opportunity for an additional side effect from the vaccination happened primarily, or to a larger extent, in the second shot. So therefore, that all things being equal, is it a reasonable expectation for us to see that more side effects happen in the third shot, build upon the second shot's direction?
Great question. So you got that correctly, as you know, that some of the side effects that you experience after the first dose could be a sore arm, maybe some fatigue, could be a little bit of redness, maybe even a little bit of fever. You could be tired, those types of things, and that those symptoms were a bit more pronounced after the second dose. But the data, as I understand it, would suggest that if you did not have any serious complication after their first or second dose, you're unlikely to have it after your third dose. However, you could, in fact, experience those symptoms that you typically get after vaccination. So we just talked about those, the sore arm and that sort of stuff. It could be a little bit more intense after the third dose. You could be a little bit more tired, but serious complications, I'm not aware of data to suggest that that's a problem after the third dose if you haven't had problems with the first and second. So I don't think that's a big issue.
James, thanks so much. We have a bunch of callers I want to try to get on before the show runs out. So let's move along to Lilian in Saskatoon. Hi, Lilian.
Yes, hi. Yes, I understand that they want to start vaccinating children soon, and children have been relatively, they haven't really had serious effects from COVID. And I was wondering, is it necessary to subject them to the adverse reactions and even deaths that have happened in adults?
The only deaths that I'm aware of in adults were from the very, very rare complication of blood clots in a very small group of individuals after the AstraZeneca vaccine. There was also pericarditis associated with the mRNA vaccines, but I think all of those patients recovered. And you are correct that children don't seem to suffer to the same degree as the adult population. But that number's not zero either. And, you know, the possibility that a child could become severely ill and end up in the intensive care unit is not a theoretical problem. That's actually happened. And, you know, we have seen children die from this particular infection. So then it becomes a question of two things, one of which, do you really want to take that chance with a child that they could become one of these unfortunate cases that have a more severe infection? So I think that's the most important question. The second question is that seeing how the number of positives are so high in the younger age children these days, will we see severe infections increase as more children become infected? I can't answer that because I don't have that data. But also the important role then that children will play as reservoirs for transmission to other vulnerable members, either within their social bubbles or within the households. You know, I'm thinking about grandparents or aunts or uncles or somebody with underlying medical conditions. So I get your point about the question that you're asking, but but the answer has to be a much more broader answer than that. And my own personal opinion was that if I had young children, as with other vaccines, I would be having them immunized. But that's my choice, and that's the choice that I'm making, and you'll have to make the same choice for yourself.
Lilian, thanks for the call, and thanks, Dr. Blondeau. And yeah, I think it's a good time to note again that pretty consistently for the past few weeks, including yesterday, a third of new cases are in children in Saskatchewan. So something to keep in mind there as well. Let's go to Scott in Nipawin. Hi, Scott.
Hi. I guess I have two questions now, just after listening to the woman's question before me, in regards to the doctor's comments about children being reservoirs and, possibly potentially holding this disease and, passing it on to others. If those others are vaccinated to our Saskatchewan standards, what is their fear, associated with this, or what is their potential to be infected if they are vaccinated by these children? Because the disease does not really affect children all that severe.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks very much for that. So the answer to your question, at least to my way of thinking, is very straightforward. You are right. If you're double vaccinated, the likelihood that you will be severely infected or infected and develop severe disease is very, very low. That data is consistently shown by governments around the world. However, again, it's not 0%. And if you happen to be an elderly person with comorbidities, even if you're double vaccinated, the risk for reinfection and the potential for serious disease goes up. So that is where the risk actually lies. So in regards to kids, then it's twofold. One is kids could potentially become seriously infected, but secondarily, even amongst the vaccinated population, older individuals with comorbidities still are at an elevated risk when compared to the general population. And that is just the facts that are in the data. So that's how I see the explanation.
Scott, thanks for calling. Unfortunately, we don't have time for your second question because we only have a minute left before we get kicked off of air. I want to get one quick one for you, Dr. Blondo, because we asked about this weeks ago as we're talking about kids getting vaccinated. Marcel wants to know, how far away are we on an oral vaccine or nasal spray?
Haven't seen anything new on that, Peter, so I don't know.
Any final thoughts, Dr. Blondo, on just the idea of, kids 5 to 11 when they start to be able to get vaccines?
Look, Peter, people have lots of questions, and I think that's important. And I also think it's important that you have your questions answered. And, if you're making a decision for your child and you're just unsure, please consult somebody who's in the know about the vaccines, who's reviewed the literature in regards to potential side effects, who could provide you good clinical information about what your expectations are, and then help you to make your decision one way or the other as you move forward. Don't be afraid to ask.
Great stuff. Dr. Blondeau, Lorraine said you've been a rock in our journey, and you certainly have here for us on Blue Sky. We really appreciate it always, and thanks again.
It's my pleasure. You take care and be safe, and safe to everybody that's listening.
Dr. Joseph Blondeau is head of microbiology at Saskatoon's Royal University Hospital. He also teaches about infectious diseases at the University of Saskatchewan, and always very grateful for him spending the lunch hour with us here on Blue Sky for feels like years now, I believe, since the start of the pandemic. He's been joining us. So again, thanks to all of you and to Dr. Blondeau. If you have any questions or comments, you can call us on TalkBack, 1-800-661-7540. Again, that TalkBack number, 1-800-661-7540. Stay healthy, folks. Be good to each other. And remember, you'll never walk alone.